You stand on a hillside in southeastern Turkey, in the province of Şanlıurfa, where the earth stretches out in undulating waves of limestone and scrub. The year is 1997, and you are not an archaeologist. You are a shepherd named Şahin, and your days are measured in the movement of sheep across these ancient hills, in the search for grazing land that won't leave your animals hungry. The land here is deceptive in its plainness: beige stone, scattered thorn bushes, the occasional olive tree twisted by centuries of wind. But beneath your feet, beneath the accumulated dust of 12 millennia, something waits. You've walked these hills your entire life, as your father did, and his father before him. You know every outcropping, every depression, where water might collect after the rare rains. But today, as you guide your flock across a ridge locally called Karahan Tepe, which means Black Hill in Turkish, though the stone here is more gray than black, you notice something that makes you pause. Protruding from the earth, barely visible through the thin soil, are stones that don't belong. They're too regular, too deliberately shaped. You've seen enough of the landscape to know the difference between natural rock formations and something else, something that speaks of human hands. You crouch down, brushing away dirt with weathered fingers that have handled countless stones in their time. Not roughly, not primitively, but with an intention that makes your breath catch. You see what appears to be an animal, perhaps a snake, perhaps something else rendered in relief on the stone's surface. The craftsmanship is undeniable, even to your untrained eye. This is not Byzantine, not Roman, not even Hittite. This feels older, though you cannot articulate why. The stone has a weight to it, a presence that goes beyond its physical mass. You do what any sensible person would do. You report it to the authorities in Şanlıurfa. But this is 1997. And Göbekli Tepe, another site just 12 kilometers away, is only beginning to reveal its secrets under the careful excavation of Klaus Schmidt and his team. The Turkish government and the international archaeological community are focused there, on that other site that is already challenging everything scholars thought they knew about the Neolithic Revolution. Your discovery is noted, filed away, added to a list of potential sites that grows longer every year in this region that seems to overflow with buried history. The truth is that southeastern Anatolia has been known to archaeologists for over a century as a region of extraordinary significance. The area sits at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, then curving back through southeastern Turkey. This is where agriculture began, where humans first domesticated wheat and barley, where the wild ancestors of modern sheep and goats were first brought into the human sphere. Or so the story went, until recently. For decades, the narrative was clear and comfortable. Humans were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then, around 10,000 BCE, they settled down, started farming, and built the first permanent villages. Agriculture led to surplus food, which led to specialization of labor, which led to complex societies, which eventually led to civilization with its temples, cities, and writing. Civilization was the product of agriculture. People needed to be fed before they could build monuments or create art. But Göbekli Tepe had already begun to dismantle that neat sequence. When Klaus Schmidt started serious excavations there in 1995, just 2 years before your discovery at Karahan Tepe, he found massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals, foxes, lions, scorpions, snakes, birds. The pillars stood up to 5.5 meters tall and weighed up to 10 tons. They were arranged in complex circular enclosures, and they dated to approximately 9,600 BCE. The pre-pottery Neolithic A period, before the invention of pottery, before the development of agriculture, before the domestication of animals, except possibly dogs. The implications were staggering. Hunter-gatherers, people who were supposed to be living hand-to-mouth, constantly moving to follow game and seasonal plants, had somehow organized themselves to quarry, carve, transport, and erect these massive pillars. They had created complex symbolic art. They had built what appeared to be ceremonial or religious structures. And they had done all of this before they had settled down to farm. The sequence was backwards. The temple, it seemed, had come before the village. Schmidt's interpretation was that Göbekli Tepe represented a pilgrimage site, a place where dispersed groups of hunter-gatherers would gather for seasonal ceremonies. The need to support these gatherings, to feed the people who came to worship or celebrate, might have been what drove the development of agriculture. Religion, not necessity, might have been the mother of civilization. It was a revolutionary idea, one that scholars are still debating today. But you, standing on Karahan Tepe in 1997, with dirt under your fingernails and the carved stone at your feet, know none of this context. You know only that you found something significant, something that speaks across centuries in a language of worked stone and deliberate form. You return to your sheep, to the daily rhythms of pastoral life that have barely changed in this region since the Neolithic. And Karahan Tepe goes back to sleep, waiting for the world to be ready for what it has to say. The site remains largely undisturbed for another 2 decades. Archaeologists make note of it. Surveys are conducted. The stones you found are documented. But the focus remains on Göbekli Tepe, which continues to yield discovery after discovery. The circular enclosures there are found to be not isolated structures, but part of a complex that spans multiple layers, with the oldest and most sophisticated structures at the bottom and progressively simpler ones built on top over thousands of years. This too defies expectation usually. We expect human craftsmanship and organization to improve over time, not deteriorate. In 2019, 22 years after your discovery, serious excavations finally begin at Karahan Tepe under the direction of Turkish archaeologist Necmi Karul from Istanbul University. The Turkish government, recognizing the potential significance of the site and the tourism revenue that Göbekli Tepe has generated, commits substantial resources. Heavy equipment is brought in, trenches are dug, and as the earth is carefully removed, layer by layer, what emerges is staggering even to archaeologists who thought they had seen everything at Gobekli Tepe. The site is vast, covering approximately 250,000 square meters, making it significantly larger than Gobekli Tepe. The structures are different too. Where Gobekli Tepe had circular enclosures open to the sky, Karahan Tepe has chambers cut directly into the bedrock. These are not buildings constructed on the surface, but rooms excavated down into the living stone, with pillars carved from the same bedrock left standing to support the roof. It's an entirely different architectural approach, one that speaks to a different set of priorities, or perhaps a different understanding of the relationship between human space and the earth itself. As the excavation continues through 2020 and 2021, more chambers are revealed. And here's where the story takes a turn into territory that makes archaeologists both excited and nervous. Some of these chambers contain features that are difficult to explain. There are what appear to be seating areas carved into the stone benches, arranged around the walls. There are niches and alcoves, whose purpose is unclear. And most striking of all, there are pillars with carvings of human faces and figures, some showing what might be clothing or ornamentation, others possibly representing something else entirely. Shamanic transformation, perhaps, or mythological beings that straddled the boundary between human and animal. In one chamber, excavators find a panel carved with what appears to be a human figure with an oversized head or possibly wearing some kind of mask. The figure's hands are positioned in front of its chest, in a gesture that might be protective or ritual. Near it are carvings of snakes, those ubiquitous symbols that appear again and again in Neolithic art across the Near East. The snakes are rendered with attention to their scales, their sinuous movement captured in stone. What were these chambers for? The question hangs in the air as you imagine the excavators sitting around their camp in the evening, drinking tea, trying to make sense of what they're uncovering. The architecture doesn't match any known pattern. These aren't houses. There's no evidence of domestic life. No hearths, no food preparation areas, no storage. They aren't tombs either, at least not in any conventional sense. They might be ceremonial spaces, like Göbekli Tepe, but the fact that they're underground rather than above ground suggests a different kind of symbolism at work. Some researchers begin to use words like temple, sanctuary, even initiatory chamber. These are speculative terms, projections of modern religious concepts onto a society we barely understand. But the speculation isn't baseless. The carved benches suggest that people gathered here, that they sat together in these underground rooms for some purpose that required seating arrangements. The elaborate carvings suggest that whatever happened here was important enough to warrant significant artistic investment, and the underground nature of the spaces suggests something about descent, about moving down into the earth, into darkness, perhaps into realms that were understood as separate from the everyday world above. Then comes the dating. Using optically stimulated luminescence, a technique that measures when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight, and examining the style of the carvings and their relationship to similar art at other sites, researchers arrive at an estimate that makes headlines around the world. Karahan Tepe appears to date to approximately 11,400 to 11,000 BCE. That makes it not just contemporary with Gobekli Tepe, but possibly older. The implications ripple outward, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. If Karahan Tepe is indeed older than Göbekli Tepe, then what we're seeing at both sites isn't an isolated phenomenon, a one-time burst of unexpected sophistication among hunter-gatherers. We're seeing evidence of a culture, a civilization perhaps, that was far more advanced, far more organized, and far more widespread than anyone imagined. These weren't random groups of nomads occasionally gathering to pile up some rocks. This was a society capable of large-scale construction projects, of sophisticated symbolic art, of creating permanent ritual centers that served communities across a wide region. And if that's true, then what else was this society capable of? What else did they build that we haven't found yet? How did they organize themselves socially and politically? What did they believe? How did they understand the cosmos and their place in it? These questions lead to others, spiraling outward into territory, where solid archaeology begins to blur into speculation. Where peer-reviewed papers meet popular books with provocative titles, where serious researchers find themselves rubbing shoulders with fringe theorists who see every ancient mystery as evidence of lost civilizations or ancient aliens. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. You're still standing on that hillside, 28 years in the past, with your sheep bleeding behind you and that carved stone at your feet. You don't know yet that this moment, this ordinary day in the life of a shepherd, doing what shepherds have done in this region for millennia, is part of a story that will force scholars to reconsider everything they thought they knew about human history. You don't know that the stone you found is just the exposed tip of something vast and complex, something that has been waiting beneath the earth for over 11,000 years to tell its story. You stand, brush the dirt from your hands, and call to your sheep. The sun is moving toward the horizon, and there's still work to be done before nightfall. The stone will be there tomorrow. The authorities will come, eventually. For now, you have responsibilities, animals to tend, a living to make, the immediate concerns of daily life that have always taken precedence over ancient mysteries, even when those mysteries lie quite literally beneath your feet. And in this, you're connected to those ancient people who carved these stones, who also had daily concerns, who also tended animals and worried about water and food and the changing seasons, even as they somehow found the time and resources to create monuments that would outlast their society by thousands of years. What drove them to do it? What was so important that it was worth the immense labor of carving through bedrock, of shaping massive pillars, of creating art that would be buried and hidden? And why, if they were capable of such sophisticated construction and organization, didn't they go on to develop what we would recognize as civilization cities? Writing, centralized states. Why did they build these elaborate structures and then, within a few thousand years, apparently abandon them, deliberately burying them beneath tons of rubble and moving on? These are the questions that will drive archaeologists to Karahan Tepe year after year, that will fuel countless academic papers and conferences, that will capture the public imagination and make this obscure hillside in southeastern Turkey one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. But right now, in this moment, the questions are unasked. The site is unknown, and you're just a shepherd who found an interesting stone while doing your job. Sometimes, that's how history works. Not with dramatic revelations, but with small observations, quiet discoveries, the accumulated noticing of ordinary people going about their lives in landscapes that hold more history than anyone realizes. The sheep are moving away, heading toward the better grazing on the north slope. You follow, leaving the carved stone behind, not knowing that you've just participated in a moment that will eventually be written into textbooks, cited in papers, argued over in academic journals. For now, it's just another day. Another evening, coming on in the eternal hills of Anatolia. The story, like the stone itself, waits patiently beneath the surface, ready to emerge when the time is right. The excavations that begin in earnest in 2019 proceed with the methodical slowness that characterizes good archaeology. This is not treasure hunting, not the dramatic uncovering of golden artifacts for museum display cases. This is the painstaking work of documenting context, of understanding the relationship between objects and the soil layers they're found in, of collecting samples for dating and analysis, of photographing and measuring and recording every detail before anything is moved. It's work that requires patience, precision, and a tolerance for the fact that most of what you uncover won't be spectacular. It will be broken pottery shards, animal bones, charcoal from ancient fires, the mundane detritus of daily life that somehow holds more information than the elaborately carved pillars that capture headlines. The team at Karahan Tepe, led by Necmi Karul, works in the Turkish summer heat, which can reach 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit or higher. They start early, before dawn, trying to get as much done as possible before the midday sun makes physical labor dangerous. They sift through buckets of soil, looking for tiny artifacts that might otherwise be missed. They use dental picks and brushes to clean around delicate carvings. They take thousands of photographs from every angle, creating three-dimensional models of the structures using photogrammetry. They collect samples of everything: stone chips from carving work, soil from different layers, organic material for radiocarbon dating if any can be found. What they discover challenges not just the timeline of human development but also some of the assumptions about how Neolithic societies functioned. The sheer scale of Karahan Tepe suggests a level of social organization that wasn't supposed to exist before agriculture. Someone had to plan these structures. Someone had to organize the labor force needed to carve through bedrock. Someone had to ensure that workers were fed and housed during the construction period. Someone had to maintain the site once it was built. All of this requires coordination, hierarchy, some kind of authority structure that can compel or convince people to work toward a common goal, rather than simply pursuing their own immediate survival needs. But here's the puzzle. We have no evidence of houses at Karahan Tepe, just as we have none at Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe. And that's we have none at Göbekli Tepe. We have no evidence of agricultural fields, no grinding stones for processing grain in large quantities, no storage facilities for surplus food. What we have are these elaborate ritual structures, and nothing else. It's as if the people who built and used these sites appeared, created these monuments, performed whatever ceremonies or activities they performed, and then vanished back into the landscape, leaving behind only stone and mystery. The most reasonable explanation, the one that most archaeologists working on these sites favor, is that Karahan Tepe, like Göbekli Tepe, was a special place, a ceremonial center that drew people from a wide area. The actual homes and villages of the people who built these monuments must be somewhere else, perhaps scattered across the landscape in seasonal camps that left few permanent traces. The people would gather at Karahan Tepe for specific occasions, seasonal festivals, initiations, important ceremonies, and then disperse again. The site itself wasn't lived in permanently, but was maintained by the communities that used it, perhaps by a rotating group of caretakers or a specialized class of ritual practitioners. This interpretation makes sense given what we know about hunter-gatherer societies from ethnographic studies. Many such societies have special places, mountains, caves, particular groves, or clearings where important ceremonies are conducted. These places are often understood as thresholds, as locations where the boundary between the ordinary world and the sacred or spirit world becomes permeable. To build permanent structures at such places, to mark them with art and architecture, would be a way of establishing and maintaining that sacredness across generations. But this interpretation also raises questions. If these were hunter-gatherers moving seasonally across the landscape, how did they maintain the continuity of knowledge and practice necessary to use these sites over centuries or even millennia? Who taught the younger generations what ceremonies to perform, what songs to sing, what stories to tell in these underground chambers? Among mobile hunter-gatherers, cultural transmission happens primarily through direct teaching and observation. There's no writing to record the details of rituals, no permanent infrastructure to embody cultural memory. Yet the evidence suggests that these sites were used, maintained, and eventually deliberately buried over periods of time that span many human generations. Something held this culture together, maintained its coherence across time and space in ways that we don't fully understand. Perhaps the sites themselves served as the memory keepers. The carvings, the architectural forms, the spatial organization. These could all function as mnemonic devices, as prompts for ritual action and storytelling. When you enter a chamber at Karahan Tepe, when you see the carved panels and the arranged seating, when you experience the darkness and the sense of being enclosed within the earth, all of this creates a powerful sensory experience that would be difficult to forget. The space itself teaches you how to use it, what to feel, perhaps even what to think. This is architecture as cognitive technology, as a way of shaping human consciousness and preserving cultural information across time. Or perhaps we're wrong about the lack of permanent settlement. Perhaps the builders of Karahan Tepe did live there, at least seasonally, but in structures that left few archaeological traces: tents made of hides, temporary shelters made of wood and brush, buildings whose foundations were shallow and whose materials degraded completely over the millennia. The focus of archaeological excavation has been on the stone structures because those are what survive and what are most visually impressive. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The domestic structures might be there, just harder to find, buried deeper, or degraded beyond recognition. As you consider these possibilities, sitting perhaps in a cafe in Şanlıurfa in the evening after a day of excavation, you realize how much we still don't know. Every answer leads to new questions. Every discovery opens up new mysteries, and underlying all of it is a more fundamental question: why? Why did these people invest so much labor and artistry in creating these underground chambers? What did they get out of it that was worth the enormous cost in time and energy? The question of motivation is perhaps the hardest for archaeology to address. We can describe what people did. We can sometimes determine when and how they did it. But understanding why, understanding the internal logic, the belief systems, the emotional and psychological needs that drove behavior, that requires a kind of time travel that isn't possible. We can make informed guesses, based on cross-cultural comparisons, on what we know about human psychology and social behavior, on patterns that appear in different times and places. But we can never really know what it felt like to be a person in 11,000 BCE. What they worried about, what they hoped for, what gave their lives meaning. What we can say is that whatever drove the creation of Karahan Tepe was powerful enough to mobilize substantial communal effort over extended periods of time. It was important enough to warrant incredible artistic investment. And it was meaningful enough that the practices associated with the site continued for centuries or longer, passed down through enough generations that the original purpose and significance remained vital and compelling, even as the specific details may have evolved. This tells us something important about our species. It tells us that the things we often think of as luxuries, art, ritual, symbolic thought, the creation of special places set apart from the everyday. These aren't add-ons that appear only after basic survival needs are met. They're fundamental to what makes us human, even when life was materially harder than we can imagine. Even when securing food and shelter required constant effort. Even when infant mortality was high and lifespans were short, people still found ways to create beauty, to mark significance, to build structures that spoke to something beyond mere survival. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. But perhaps that's backwards. Perhaps our problems and our possibilities stem from our inability to simply survive. On building cathedrals and carving pillars, on making the world more than just a place to extract resources. They had to dig into the bedrock, had to create spaces that transformed the earth itself into something meaningful, had to leave marks that would outlast them by millennia. And now, 12,000 years later, to connect across that vast gulf of time with people who were like us in their basic humanity, but who lived in a world so different from ours that it might as well be another planet. We don't share their beliefs. We can't observe their practices or ask them to explain themselves. Stone, and the questions it raises, and the humbling realization of how much we don't know about our own past. You stand at the entrance to Chamber 11, one of the most extensively excavated spaces at Karahan Tepe, and you feel the temperature drop as you prepare to descend. The surface temperature is still hovering around 35 degrees Celsius, but below ground, where the sun never reaches, the rock maintains a constant coolness. This transition from heat to cool, from light to darkness, from the open sky to enclosed stone, was almost certainly deliberate. The builders of Karahan Tepe chose to go down into the earth rather than building up from it. This choice tells us something. Though what exactly remains a subject of intense debate. You descend carefully down modern stairs that have been installed for safety. But you try to imagine what the original entrance was like. Probably a steeper descent, possibly requiring the use of hands as well as feet. Definitely more challenging than the gentle grade that modern construction allows. The difficulty of entry might have been part of the point, a physical barrier that marked the transition from ordinary space to something else. Something that required effort to reach and therefore signaled its special status. The chamber opens up around you. Your eyes adjust to the dimmer light. Electric lights have been installed for the excavation work, but they're positioned to minimize shadows rather than create dramatic illumination. What you see is a roughly rectangular space, perhaps 8 meters by 6 meters, with walls that show clear evidence of having been carved rather than built. The rock face bears the marks of stone tools' pecking marks, grooves where harder stone was used to pound and scrape away softer limestone. This wasn't quick work. Creating a chamber this size would have required weeks or months of labor, probably by multiple workers taking turns in the confined space. The ceiling is lower than you might expect, perhaps 2.5 meters at its highest point. This creates a sense of enclosure, of being contained, that would have been even more pronounced in the past, when the chamber would have been lit only by oil lamps or torches, if it was lit at all. Some researchers have suggested that at least some ceremonies might have been conducted in total darkness, with participants relying on sound and touch rather than vision. The acoustic properties of these underground chambers are remarkable. Sound reverberates and carries in ways that it doesn't in open air. A voice speaking or chanting in Chamber 11 takes on an otherworldly quality, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Along the walls of the chamber, you see the features that make Karahan Tepe unique among Neolithic sites. There are pillars, yes, similar in their T-shaped form to those at Göbekli Tepe, but these haven't been erected. They've been carved from the living rock, left standing as the surrounding stone was cut away. The effect is striking. The pillars aren't separate objects placed in the chamber. They're continuous with the chamber itself, growing organically from floor and ceiling. This creates a different relationship between pillar and space than what we see at Gobekli Tepe. These pillars don't hold up the roof, the bedrock does that. They serve some other purpose, perhaps marking points of ritual significance within the chamber, perhaps representing something symbolic that we don't yet understand. Around 3 walls of the chamber, cut into the stone at roughly seat height, are benches. These are unmistakable, long, continuous ledges that would allow multiple people to sit facing inward toward the center of the room. The benches are roughly carved, not smoothed or polished, but they're clearly functional. You can sit on them, and you do, carefully, trying to imagine what it would have been like to be here 11,000 years ago. Sitting in darkness or flickering firelight, surrounded by others whose faces you might barely be able to see. How many people could this chamber hold? If we assume the benches along 3 walls could seat perhaps 20 to 30 people, and allow for a few more standing or sitting in the center of the space, we're looking at a capacity of maybe 40 to 50 people maximum. And that would be quite crowded. This isn't a space designed for large gatherings. Whatever happened here was relatively intimate, involving small groups rather than masses. This has implications for how we understand the social structure of the people who used this site. If Karahan Tepe was a regional ceremonial center, drawing people from across southeastern Anatolia, but its chambers could only accommodate small groups at a time, then either ceremonies were repeated multiple times for different groups, or access was restricted to certain individuals, elders, perhaps, or ritual specialists, or people undergoing specific initiations. The walls of the chamber bear carvings, though not as elaborate as some of those found in other chambers at the site. You see what appears to be a fox, rendered in profile, its tail curved upward. The fox is a recurring motif at both Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe, appearing again and again in the carved panels. What did the fox mean to these people? In later Near Eastern cultures, foxes were often associated with cunning, with crossing between worlds, with trickster figures who mediated between humans and gods. But we can't simply project these later meanings backward onto a culture separated from those later societies by thousands of years and profound social transformations. The fox might have meant something entirely different to the builders of Karahan Tepe, something we have no way of recovering. Near the fox, you see what might be a snake, though the carving is less clear. The problem with interpreting Neolithic art is that it exists at the edge of our ability to understand. We don't have the Rosetta Stone equivalent for this time period, no bilingual inscription that lets us connect these images to words and meanings. We have only the images themselves and our attempts to make sense of them, which inevitably tell us as much about our own preoccupations as they do about the people who created the art. What we do know, from careful archaeological documentation, is that these carvings were not random decoration added casually over time. They were planned, executed with skill and care, and positioned deliberately within the space. The animals depicted are predominantly wild species: aurochs, wild cattle, gazelles, foxes, snakes, birds of prey. Domestic animals are conspicuously absent, which aligns with what we know about the time period. These were still hunter-gatherers, or at most people in the very early stages of animal domestication. The animals carved on the walls were animals they hunted, animals they observed in their environment, animals that perhaps featured in their mythology and cosmology. But notice what else is absent. There are very few human figures in the art at Karahan Tepe. At Gobekli Tepe, we occasionally see stylized human forms, but even there, they're rare compared to the animal imagery. At Karahan Tepe, human representation is even more scarce. When humans do appear, they're often ambiguous, sometimes seeming to blend human and animal features in ways that might represent transformation, shamanic practice, or mythological beings that were understood as neither fully human nor fully animal. This absence of human representation is intriguing. It might suggest that the human place in the cosmos was understood differently than in later periods, rather than seeing themselves as central, as masters of creation or the pinnacle of existence. Perhaps these early people understood themselves as one species among many, all connected in a web of relationships that the ceremonies conducted in chambers like this one were meant to maintain or repair or celebrate. The animals weren't just food sources or threats to be managed, they were participants in a shared world, worthy of artistic attention and perhaps religious reverence. As you sit on the stone bench in Chamber 11, trying to feel your way into this ancient worldview, you become aware of the silence. Modern archaeological sites, even active ones, have moments of profound quiet when the workers break for lunch or when excavation pauses for documentation and photography. In these moments, the only sounds are natural ones, wind across the site, perhaps the call of a bird, the rustle of grass. No engines, no voices, no mechanical noise. And you realize that for the people who originally used this chamber, this level of silence would have been normal, unremarkable. The background noise level of the pre-industrial world was dramatically lower than what we experience today. The soundscape of Neolithic life was dominated by natural sounds, by human voices, by the wind and water and animals. In this silence, any sound would carry significance. The scrape of feet on stone as people entered the chamber, the breathing of 30 or 40 people gathered in an enclosed space, the voice of whoever led the ceremony, speaking or chanting or singing in the darkness. The sound would reverberate off the stone walls, would seem to emanate from the pillars themselves, would create an acoustic environment that enhanced the sense of being in a special place, separated from the ordinary world. This is something that archaeologists are increasingly paying attention to: the archaeoacoustics of ancient sites, the ways that sound behavior shaped and was shaped by architectural choices. Some researchers have even conducted experiments, bringing musicians into ancient sites to see how different instruments and voices sound in these spaces. The results are often striking. Drums, in particular, seem to have been designed for or naturally suited to these underground chambers. A drum played in Chamber 11 produces a deep, resonant sound that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. The frequency and reverb create a physical sensation, a vibration that affects your body. Extended drumming can induce altered states of consciousness. This is well documented in both historical and contemporary ritual contexts. It's not hard to imagine that the builders of Karahan Tepe understood this, that the chambers were designed in part to serve as resonating spaces for drumming and chanting and other sound-based ritual practices. But we're speculating again, moving beyond what we can know with certainty. Let's return to what we can document. The floor of Chamber 11 shows interesting features. In the center of the space, there's a depression, roughly circular, perhaps half a meter in diameter, and maybe 20 centimeters deep. Was this for fire? For water? For offerings of some kind? The rock around the depression doesn't show evidence of burning, which suggests that if fires were lit in the chamber, they might have been small and temporary, perhaps using braziers or lamps rather than open fires built directly on the floor. This makes sense. You wouldn't want too much smoke in an enclosed underground space. Even with an entrance, exit that could serve as a chimney, excessive smoke would make the chamber unusable. If not fire, then perhaps water. In many cultures, water in sacred spaces serves multiple functions: purification, reflection, the creation of a symbolic threshold or boundary. A shallow pool in the center of the chamber could have been used for ritual bathing or washing, for creating reflections in lamplight, for offerings or libations. Or perhaps the depression held something else entirely: grain, perhaps, or animal blood, or objects brought as offerings by participants in whatever ceremonies took place here. What we find in this depression when it's excavated provides some clues, but raises as many questions as it answers. The fill is composed primarily of broken pottery, sherds, animal bones, and charcoal. This suggests that at some point, perhaps near the end of the chamber's active use, offerings were placed here and possibly burned. The pottery is crude, consistent with the pre-pottery Neolithic designation. Despite its name, pottery existed in this period but was rare and simple. The animal bones are primarily from gazelles and aurochs, confirming that these wild animals were being hunted and consumed, or at least that their bones were being used in ritual contexts. But here's what's interesting. The fill of the depression appears to have been deposited all at once, or over a very short period. not gradually accumulated over years of use. It's as if someone conducted a final ceremony, filled the depression with offerings, and then the chamber was abandoned. Or, not quite abandoned, deliberately closed. Perhaps sealed as part of a ritual ending that was as important as the original opening and consecration of the space. This pattern of deliberate termination of ritual spaces appears at multiple locations at Karahan Tepe, just as it does at Göbekli Tepe. These weren't buildings that fell into ruin through neglect. They were carefully and ceremonially decommissioned, filled with rubble and earth in what must have been a labor-intensive process that mirrored the labor required to create them in the first place. Why? Why go to such effort to bury these chambers? The question nags at you as you sit in the cool darkness, surrounded by 11,000-year-old stone. One possibility is that the beliefs or practices associated with the site changed, and the old ritual spaces needed to be closed in a proper way before new ones could be created. Another possibility is that the community that maintained the site dispersed or died out, and the final act of the last practitioners was to properly close the sacred space to ensure it didn't fall into inappropriate use or become polluted by profane activities. A third possibility is that the burial was always part of the plan, that these chambers were understood as temporary, meant to serve their purpose for a generation or a few generations, and then be returned to the earth. Each of these possibilities tells a different story about how these people understood sacred space and time. If the site changed because beliefs evolved, that suggests a society capable of religious innovation, of adapting its practices to new circumstances or insights. If the site was closed because the community could no longer maintain it, that suggests a more fragile social organization, dependent on specific knowledge keepers whose loss meant the loss of the entire tradition. If the burial was always planned, that suggests a sophisticated understanding of cycles, of beginnings and endings, of the temporal nature of even the most permanent-seeming stone structures. We don't know which, if any, of these scenarios is correct. We probably never will. But the act of asking the question, of trying to understand not just what happened but why, brings us into a kind of dialogue with these ancient people. We sit where they sat, in spaces they created, trying to think our way into their mindset, knowing we'll never fully succeed but compelled to try anyway. This is what makes archaeology more than just treasure hunting or artifact collection. It's an attempt at empathy across time, a reaching out to minds and lives separated from us by vast gulfs of change, but connected to us by the continuity of human consciousness, by the fact that we share the same basic cognitive architecture, the same capacity for symbolic thought and ritual practice, and the creation of meaning. You stand from the bench, your legs slightly stiff from sitting on cold stone, and you make your way toward the entrance of the chamber. As you climb back toward the surface, moving from darkness toward light, from cool toward heat, from enclosed toward open, you're retracing a journey that was made countless times over the centuries or millennia that this chamber was in active use. Each person who descended into this space and then returned to the surface was enacting a pattern, a movement that might have been understood as symbolic, a descent into the underworld or the earth or the realm of the ancestors, followed by a return to the world of the living. Death and rebirth, ending and beginning. The eternal cycle that all religious traditions recognize and ritualize in their own ways. The psychology of this is profound. To voluntarily enter an underground space, to submit yourself to darkness and enclosure, requires trust. Trust in the structure, trust in the people who lead you there, trust in the belief system that makes this frightening action meaningful rather than merely dangerous. This act of trust, repeated over and over, would create and reinforce social bonds, would mark those who had undergone the experience as different from those who hadn't, would create a sense of shared identity among initiates. This is powerful social technology, a way of creating cohesion and shared purpose in a society that otherwise lacked the formal hierarchies and institutions that later civilizations would develop. And yet, we must be careful not to romanticize. The act of descent might have been terrifying. The ceremonies conducted in the darkness might have included elements that we would find disturbing, possibly including psychoactive substances, certainly including experiences designed to induce altered states of consciousness, perhaps including physical ordeals, or confrontations with images and ideas that challenged participants' sense of self and reality. The anthropological record of initiation ceremonies across cultures suggests that they often include elements of trial, of testing, of pushing participants to their psychological and physical limits. The beautiful carvings and the sophisticated architecture don't necessarily indicate gentle or benign practices. They indicate importance, significance, the investment of tremendous cultural energy into whatever it was that happened in these spaces. As you emerge into sunlight, blinking against the brightness, you carry with you more questions than answers. What did it feel like to be here 11,000 years ago? What did people believe they were doing when they descended into the earth? What did they experience in the darkness? What did they bring back with them when they returned to the surface? These questions might be unanswerable, but they're not pointless. They remind us that behind every artifact, every structure, every carved stone, there were living people with interior lives as rich and complex as our own. People who loved and feared and wondered, people who tried to make sense of their existence in a vast and often incomprehensible universe. The chambers at Karahan Tepe are, in the end, attempts to create meaning, to impose order on chaos, to connect the mundane world of daily survival with something transcendent, or at least different, something that made the hardship of life bearable by placing it in a larger context. We still do this, of course, in our own ways, through religion, through art, through philosophy, through science. The tools and languages have changed, but the underlying human need remains constant. We need to believe that our lives mean something, that we're part of something larger than ourselves, that our brief moment of consciousness in the universe has significance beyond its material facts. The people who carved these chambers 11,000 years ago were trying to answer the same questions we still ask. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? They answered in stone and ritual, and darkness and gathering. We answer in different ways, but we're answering the same questions. And when we descend into their chambers, when we sit on their benches and trace their carvings with our eyes and try to feel what they felt, we're reaching across time to shake hands with our ancestors, to acknowledge the continuity of human questioning and human creativity and human meaning-making that links us to them despite all the changes that have occurred in the 12,000 years since they carved these stones. As excavations continue at Karahan Tepe through 2020, 2021, and into 2022, more chambers are revealed, each with its own distinctive features. Chamber 7 contains what appears to be a carved panel depicting multiple human figures, some with their arms raised, others in poses that might suggest dancing or ritual movement. The figures are stylized, reduced to essential forms, but there's a sense of movement and relationship among them that's rare in Neolithic art. This isn't isolated individuals depicted separately. This is a group, people in relationship with each other, possibly engaged in collective action. The discovery of this panel creates considerable excitement among the research team. Human figures engaged in apparent ritual action. This is exactly the kind of evidence that could help us understand what these chambers were used for. But as always in archaeology, closer examination complicates the picture. Some of the figures have features that don't quite make sense. Heads that seem too large or oddly shaped. Hands that appear to have too many or too few fingers. Bodies that might be clothed or might be something else entirely. Are these realistic depictions of humans in costumes or masks? Are they mythological beings? Are they representations of shamanic transformation, showing the transition from human to spirit form? Dr. Karul and his team photograph the panel extensively, create detailed drawings and 3D models, and invite specialists in rock art and Neolithic symbolism to examine it. The interpretations vary widely. Some see clear evidence of shamanic practice, pointing to ethnographic parallels in Siberian and Native American cultures, where shamans are depicted as part human, part animal during their trance journeys. Others argue that we're seeing masked dancers engaged in ceremonies that might have included costumes made from animal skins and heads, similar to practices documented in later Neolithic and Bronze Age contexts. Still others suggest that these aren't realistic depictions at all, but rather symbolic representations of concepts or forces that we have no hope of understanding without access to the culture's own explanations of its symbolism. What everyone agrees on is that the panel is sophisticated and deliberate. This isn't crude scratching on stone, but carefully planned and executed artwork that required skill and vision. Someone conceived of this composition, this arrangement of figures in relationship to each other. Someone else, or perhaps the same person, had the technical ability to execute that vision in stone, carving to a depth of several centimeters, creating a relief that plays with light and shadow to create a sense of three-dimensionality. This is art in the full sense of the word, not mere decoration or utilitarian marking, but the creation of a visual statement that was meant to communicate something important to those who saw it. In Chamber 8, excavators find something even more puzzling. A series of holes cut into the floor, arranged in a pattern that might be geometric or might be random. It's hard to tell because portions of the floor are damaged. The holes are too small to have been post holes for supporting structures, but too large and too carefully made to be mere decoration. Each hole is roughly 10 centimeters in diameter and perhaps 15 centimeters deep, carved with smooth sides and flat bottoms. There are 11 of them in the portion of the chamber that has been fully excavated, with the possibility of more under the rubble that hasn't yet been removed. What were these holes for? The question drives the research team to distraction. They measure the holes precisely, photograph them from every angle, examine them for traces of whatever might have been placed in them. Under microscopic examination, the interior surfaces of the holes show organic residue, suggesting that something was indeed placed in them, something that has long since decomposed beyond recognition. Wood? Plant matter? Bones? The residue isn't specific enough to determine, requiring samples to be sent to specialized laboratories. While they wait for chemical analysis results, the team engages in informed speculation. Perhaps the holes held wooden posts, markers of some kind that defined sacred space within the chamber. Perhaps they held offerings, grain, oil, blood, other substances that were poured or placed into the holes as part of ritual practice. Perhaps they functioned as sockets for lamps, with the bases of oil lamps fitting into the holes to keep them stable and upright. This last possibility is intriguing because it would mean the chamber could be systematically illuminated, with 11 lamps creating a relatively bright and evenly distributed light source. For ceremonies that required participants to see clearly, to read carved symbols perhaps, or to perform coordinated movements, such illumination would be essential. The pattern of the holes, if it is a pattern and not random, might encode some kind of meaning. 11 is an interesting number. It's prime, for one thing, which might or might not have been significant to Neolithic people. It's also odd, which, in many cultural systems, is associated with imbalance, movement, dynamism, as opposed to the stability and completeness suggested by even numbers. But again, we're projecting potentially anachronistic meanings onto a culture that might have thought about numbers in entirely different ways. Without written records, without access to these people's own explanations of their symbolism, we're always operating in the realm of educated guesswork. What we can say with more confidence is that the creation of these holes required deliberate effort. Stone is hard to work with using stone tools. To create 11 holes to relatively uniform size and depth would have taken hours of labor, probably by someone with specific skills in stone carving. The fact that this effort was expended suggests that whatever the holes were for, it was important. They're not afterthoughts or casual additions. They're planned features of the chamber, as integral to its design as the carved pillars or the seating benches. As the excavation season progresses, the team makes another discovery that complicates the picture further. In the rubble that fills Chamber 8, they find fragments of carved stone that don't match any of the in situ carvings in the chamber. These fragments appear to be from panels or pillars that were deliberately broken and then used as fill when the chamber was closed. Some of the fragments show clear signs of intentional breakage, straight edges that suggest the stone was struck along natural fault lines, controlled fracturing that reduced large carved pieces into smaller chunks. This tells us something important about how these sites were decommissioned. It wasn't just a matter of throwing dirt and rubble into the chambers to fill them up. The process included the breaking of carved elements, the dismantling of the very art and architecture that had been so carefully created. This wasn't neglect or vandalism. This was ritual destruction. A deliberate act of ending that must have carried its own symbolic weight. Perhaps breaking the carved stones was understood as releasing whatever power or significance they held. Perhaps it was a way of ensuring that the sacred space couldn't be misused or reactivated by people who didn't have the proper authority or knowledge. Perhaps it was simply part of a cultural pattern we don't understand, a necessary component of properly closing a ritual site. The broken fragments are carefully collected, photographed, and catalogued. Some of them can be partially reconstructed, fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle, to recreate at least portions of the original carved panels. One reconstructed fragment shows what appears to be a large bird of prey, possibly a vulture, with its wings spread. Vultures are significant in the iconography of several Neolithic sites in the Near East. At Çatalhöyük, a later Neolithic settlement dating to around 7,500 BCE, wall paintings show vultures apparently engaging in excarnation, the removal of flesh from human corpses as part of burial practices. Whether the vulture at Karahan Tepe carried similar significance, or whether vultures meant something entirely different to these earlier people, we can't know for certain. But the presence of vulture imagery raises interesting questions about death practices and beliefs about the afterlife. Vultures are liminal creatures, existing at the boundary between life and death, consuming the dead and transforming death into continued life through their own survival. In many cultures, animals that mediate between categories, between life and death, between earth and sky, between human and non-human, carry special, symbolic significance. They're threshold guardians, psychopomps, beings that can move between worlds or states that are usually separated. If the people of Karahan Tepe were representing vultures in their sacred spaces, they might have been engaging with these liminal qualities, thinking about how death transforms into life, how endings enable new beginnings, how the boundaries we perceive as solid and uncrossable might actually be permeable under the right circumstances. And the act of conducting rituals in underground chambers, spaces that are literally liminal, neither fully inside the earth nor fully outside it, neither completely natural nor completely cultural, reinforces this engagement with thresholds and transitions. You imagine a ceremony conducted in Chamber 8 11,000 years ago. Perhaps it's night, because rituals in enclosed spaces often occur at night when the boundary between ordinary consciousness and altered states is understood to be thinner. Participants descend into the chamber, perhaps having prepared themselves through fasting or other purification practices. Once everyone is gathered, lamps are lit and placed in the 11 holes in the floor, illuminating the space with flickering, unsteady light that makes the carved figures on the walls seem to move and shift. There's drumming, perhaps, or chanting, sounds that fill the chamber and reverberate off the stone walls and ceiling. The acoustics make it difficult to tell where sound is coming from. It seems to emanate from the stones themselves, as if the earth were singing. In this state, sensory reduced in some ways darkness, enclosure, but enhanced in others. Focused light, reverberating sound, collective presence. Participants might undergo significant psychological experiences. Feelings of unity with the group, dissolution of normal ego boundaries, encounters with visions or internal images that are interpreted as messages from ancestors or spirits. These aren't necessarily mystical experiences in some supernatural sense. They're natural psychological phenomena that occur under conditions of sensory manipulation and social pressure, documented in laboratory settings, as well as ritual contexts. But for the people experiencing them, they're real and meaningful, providing validation for the belief system and strengthening commitment to the community and its practices. Then, at some point, maybe an hour later, maybe several hours later, the ceremony ends. Lamps are extinguished. The participants sit in complete darkness for a period, perhaps to allow their eyes to readjust before attempting to climb out. Perhaps as part of the ritual structure itself, a moment of sensory deprivation before the return to normal consciousness. Then, Slowly, carefully, people make their way back to the surface, back to the night air and stars, back to the ordinary world that they left behind when they descended. They're changed by the experience, marked by it, bonded to others who shared it, carriers now of whatever knowledge or insight or simply memory was created in the darkness below. This scenario is speculative, of course, stitched together from pieces of archaeological evidence, cross-cultural comparisons, and psychological principles. But it's not wildly speculative. Every element of it, the underground setting, the controlled illumination, the use of sound, the manipulation of consciousness through ritual practice, is documented in various ethnographic contexts. Human cultures across time and space have discovered that certain practices reliably produce certain experiences, and they've used those practices for purposes ranging from social bonding to healing to communication with whatever they understand as the divine or transcendent. What makes Karahan Tepe remarkable is not that these practices occurred. They probably occurred in many places and times, but that these people invested so much effort in creating permanent spaces for them. Most hunter-gatherer ritual practices don't require elaborate architecture. A clearing in the forest, a cave, a mountaintop, even just a circle of people gathered around a fire, these are sufficient for most ceremonial purposes. The decision to carve chambers into bedrock, to create pillars and benches and carved panels, suggests that what happened at Karahan Tepe was understood as particularly important enough to literally reshape the landscape to accommodate it. And this brings us back to questions of social organization. In a mobile hunter-gatherer society with relatively flat hierarchies, these questions don't have obvious answers. Maybe the Neolithic societies of southeastern Anatolia weren't as egalitarian as we typically assume hunter-gatherers to be. Maybe the monumental architecture at sites like Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe is itself evidence of emerging hierarchy, of specialists who controlled ritual knowledge and used that control to organize communal labor. Maybe these sites mark a transitional moment when human societies were becoming more complex, when the relatively simple organization of Paleolithic bands was giving way to something new, something that would eventually develop into the hierarchical, stratified societies we see in later Neolithic and Bronze Age contexts. Or maybe not. Maybe it's possible for relatively egalitarian societies to undertake substantial collective projects without coercive hierarchy, through consensus and shared commitment to common goals. Maybe our assumptions about what kinds of social organization are necessary for monumental architecture are wrong, shaped by our own experience of states and classes and institutionalized power. Maybe Karahan Tepe shows us that human beings are capable of creating impressive things without needing kings or priests or bureaucrats to force or trick them into it. These are not just academic questions. They touch on fundamental issues of human nature and human possibility. Are hierarchy and inequality inevitable once societies reach a certain size or complexity? Or are there alternatives, ways of organizing social life that preserve equality and autonomy while still enabling collective action? The archaeological record might not give us definitive answers, but it can at least show us that human societies have experimented with many different arrangements, not all of which fit into our familiar categories and expectations. As the sun sets over Karahan Tepe and the excavation team packs up their tools for the day, these questions hang in the air like the dust that rises from the dry earth. Tomorrow they'll return. We'll continue the slow work of revelation. We'll perhaps find new chambers or new carvings that will add to the picture or complicate it further. But tonight, there's time to sit and think, to try to make sense of what they've found, to wonder about the people who created these spaces and what they were trying to achieve. The stones don't answer. They just sit there, patient and silent, holding their secrets until someone asks the right questions or develops the right tools to extract more information. And maybe even then, maybe even with all our science and analysis and cross-cultural comparison, some secrets will remain forever locked in the past, known only to the people who lived it and died, taking their knowledge with them. That's the humbling reality of archaeology. The past is another country, and we're always foreigners there, trying to understand a language we'll never fully speak. By 2023, excavations at Karahan Tepe have revealed portions of at least 9 chambers, each with distinctive features, but all sharing certain common elements: the underground location, the carved pillars, the seating areas, the elaborate artistic programs. The site is now understood to be even larger than initially estimated, potentially covering up to 300,000 square meters, with many more structures still buried. The Turkish government has committed to long-term excavation and preservation, recognizing the site's importance not just for archaeology, but for tourism and national prestige. Karahan Tepe is being developed as a major tourist destination, with walkways, protective structures, and interpretive signage being installed to allow public access while protecting the delicate archaeological remains. This development brings its own challenges. How do you balance public access with archaeological preservation? How do you present a site whose meaning is so uncertain without either oversimplifying or drowning visitors in academic caveats? How do you tell a story that's still being written, where every excavation season might fundamentally change our understanding? These are questions that museums and heritage sites grapple with everywhere. But they're particularly acute at places like Karahan Tepe, where the findings are so spectacular and the interpretations so contested. The Turkish Tourism Board has embraced Karahan Tepe as part of what they're calling Taş Tepeler Stone Hills, a broader designation that includes Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and several other contemporary sites in the region that are now being surveyed and excavated. The marketing materials present these sites as evidence of humanity's first civilization, predating the famous sites of Mesopotamia and Egypt by thousands of years. This isn't wrong exactly, but it is simplifying a complex picture, glossing over debates about what civilization means, and whether these Neolithic societies should be classified as civilizations at all. But for the average tourist visiting Karahan Tepe, these academic debates are probably less interesting than the simple visceral impact of descending into chambers carved 11,000 years ago, of seeing the pillars and carvings, of experiencing that tangible connection to the deep past. And there's value in that experience, even if it comes packaged with simplified narratives and Instagram-friendly signage. Most people aren't archaeologists or anthropologists. They don't need or want exhaustive discussions of dating methodologies and comparative iconographic analysis. They want to feel something, to be moved by the presence of authentic antiquity, to return home with a sense of having touched something ancient and important. The challenge is ensuring that the desire to create accessible, emotionally resonant tourist experiences doesn't override the need for continued careful archaeological research. Sites like Karahan Tepe are finite resources. Every tourist who walks through a chamber, every protective structure built, every pathway installed, potentially damages or destroys archaeological evidence. The dust kicked up by thousands of feet can abrade carved surfaces. The changes in humidity and temperature caused by modern structures can accelerate weathering. The very act of excavation, of removing the earth that has protected these structures for millennia, exposes them to new threats. Dr. Karul and his team are acutely aware of these tensions. They work closely with conservation specialists to develop protocols for protecting the site even as it's being excavated and open to the public. They document everything meticulously, knowing that their records might be all that survives if the original structures deteriorate despite best efforts at preservation. They train local people to work on the excavation and to serve as site guides and guards, creating economic incentives for the community to value and protect the site rather than seeing it as just a restriction on what they can do with their land. And they continue to excavate, because despite all that has been found, they're convinced that the most significant discoveries at Karahan Tepe are still ahead. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggest the presence of many more chambers beneath the surface. Remote sensing indicates that the site extends far beyond what's currently been excavated. There might be 100 chambers at Karahan Tepe, or 200, or more. There might be chambers even larger and more elaborate than what's been found so far. There might be carvings that will finally provide clear evidence of what these spaces were for, what ceremonies were conducted in them, what beliefs motivated their creation. Or maybe not. Maybe we've already found the most impressive chambers, and everything else will be variations on familiar themes. Maybe the carvings will remain ambiguous, no matter how many we uncover. Maybe we'll never know with certainty what these spaces meant to the people who created them. That uncertainty, that fundamental limitation of archaeological knowledge, is something that researchers have to live with. You gather evidence, form hypotheses, test those hypotheses against new findings, revise your understanding as needed. But you never achieve final, complete knowledge. You never close the book on a site like Karahan Tepe and declare it fully understood. There's always more to learn, always new questions to ask, always the possibility that the next excavation season will overturn everything you thought you knew. As you stand at Karahan Tepe in the evening light, watching the sun set over the Anatolian plateau, you think about time and about the persistence of human curiosity. 11,000 years separates you from the people who carved these chambers, and yet you're connected to them through the simple fact of being here, of caring about what they made, of trying to understand what their work meant. They couldn't have imagined you, couldn't have known that people in the far future would study and wonder about their creations. They made these chambers for their own purposes, to serve their own needs and beliefs. That their work has outlasted their culture, their language, their entire way of life. That it speaks to us across such vast temporal distance is perhaps an accident, but it's a meaningful one. We leave traces, intended and unintended. We shape the world around us, and those shapes persist long after we're gone. Long after everyone who remembers us is gone. The people who carved Karahan Tepe left traces that they probably expected to last at most a few generations long enough for the children and grandchildren of the builders to use the spaces, to conduct the ceremonies, to maintain the traditions. They couldn't have anticipated that their traces would become archaeology, that their sacred spaces would become tourist destinations, that their symbols would be analyzed by people using technologies and concepts that would have been incomprehensible to them. But here we are, doing exactly that. And in doing so, we're adding our own traces to the site. Excavation trenches, documentation, interpretive structures, academic papers, social media posts, all the layered accumulation of modern interaction with ancient remains. Someone, 11,000 years from now, might excavate our excavations, might try to understand what we were trying to learn and why we cared. They might find our tools and notebooks and protective structures as puzzling as we find the pillars and carvings. They might wonder what stories we told ourselves about the past, what we hoped to learn, what we believed about human nature and history and progress. The circularity is dizzying. The past studies the past studies the past, each layer of inquiry adding its own meanings and misunderstandings, its own projections and interpretations. There's no view from nowhere, no objective perspective outside of time and culture from which to see the past as it really was. We're always seeing through the lens of our own moment, our own concerns, our own conceptual frameworks. And that's okay. That's the human condition. We work with what we have, partial evidence, limited understanding, the inevitable biases of our perspective, and we do the best we can to approach something like truth, knowing we'll never fully arrive but finding value in the journey itself. The light fades. Stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars, more or less, that the builders of Karahan Tepe saw when they emerged from their chambers after night ceremonies. The landscape has changed. Where there were probably scattered groves of trees 11,000 years ago, now there's mostly grass and scrub. The climate has shifted. The animals have changed, but the bedrock remains, and the chambers carved into it remain, and the human capacity for wonder and curiosity remains. We stand on the surface of the same earth, breathing the same air, looking at the same stars, asking the same fundamental questions about who we are and why we're here and what we should do with the brief span of consciousness we're given. Karahan Tepe doesn't answer those questions. How could it? But it reminds us that humans have always asked them, have always sought to create meaning and significance, have always invested effort in making the world more than just a place to extract resources. We're meaning-making creatures, storytelling creatures. creatures who carve our beliefs and hopes into stone and earth and anything that will hold a mark. The forms change, the specifics shift, but the underlying impulse persists across millennia. That persistence, that continuity of human striving and creating and questioning, is perhaps what Karahan Tepe's greatest lesson. We're part of a story much longer than any individual life or even any individual civilization. And that story, whatever else it might be, is worth telling, worth preserving, worth trying to understand in all its complex, ambiguous, fascinating detail. You spread a map across the table in the project office at Karahan Tepe, a map that has been marked and annotated and remarked so many times that its surface is covered with colored pins and hand-drawn circles and notes in Turkish and English and German. Each mark represents a site, a known archaeological location in southeastern Anatolia that dates to roughly the same period as Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe. There are dozens of them, scattered across the landscape like stars in a constellation whose pattern you're trying to discern. Most are just surface surveys, places where carved stones have been spotted weathering out of hillsides, where farmers have reported finding unusual objects while plowing their fields, where ground-penetrating radar or magnetometry or simply experienced archaeological eyes have detected signs of buried structures. The most famous, of course, is Göbekli Tepe. Then there's Nevala Chori, further north, partially excavated before the construction of the Ataturk Dam flooded the site in 1992, but well documented with T-shaped pillars and carved reliefs similar to Göbekli Tepe. There's Hamzan Tepe, just a few kilometers from Karahan Tepe, where preliminary excavations have revealed structures that might be contemporary. There's Gürkü Tepe, Ayanlar Hoyuk, Harbetsuvan Tepesi, Selik Tepe, Şermola Tepe, the list goes on, each Turkish name marking a location where the limestone bones of the Anatolian plateau have been carved and shaped by people 12,000 years ago. What you're looking at isn't a collection of isolated sites. It's a network, a cultural complex that spanned a region roughly the size of Ireland, encompassing what is now southeastern Turkey and extending into northern Syria before the modern border divided the landscape. The sites aren't random. They cluster in certain areas, particularly along the upper reaches of the Euphrates and Tigris river systems and their tributaries. They tend to be on elevated locations, hilltops or ridges with good visibility across the surrounding landscape. And they show consistent architectural and artistic themes. T-shaped pillars, animal carvings, circular or rectangular enclosures, the use of massive stone elements that required communal labor to quarry and position. This consistency suggests cultural contact, shared beliefs, possibly even coordinated activity across the region. But how did this coordination work? These were supposedly mobile hunter-gatherers, people without writing, without permanent settlements, without the bureaucratic infrastructure that we associate with organized societies. How did they maintain cultural continuity across such distances? How did stonemasons at different sites develop similar carving techniques? How did the symbolic system, the recurring animals, the T-shaped pillar form, the architectural patterns spread and persist? One possibility is that the sites were connected by pilgrimage routes. People would travel from one ceremonial center to another, perhaps following seasonal patterns, attending ceremonies at different locations throughout the year. This movement would serve as a mechanism for cultural transmission. Someone who learned carving techniques at Göbekli Tepe might later work on construction at Karahan Tepe. Someone initiated into ritual practices at one site might carry those practices to another. Stories, songs, mythologies, all the non-material elements of culture would travel along these routes, carried by people who moved between the sites. This model has parallels in other times and places. Medieval Europe was connected by pilgrimage routes that linked sacred sites across vast distances. Indigenous Australia was crisscrossed by songlines, traditional routes marked by sacred sites and mythological stories that could span hundreds or thousands of kilometers. The Native American Southwest had trade and ceremonial networks that connected different Pueblo groups. In each case, movement of people across landscapes served to maintain cultural coherence without requiring centralized political authority. But there are challenges with applying this model to Neolithic Anatolia. For one thing, the distances involved are substantial. Traveling 12 kilometers from Karahan Tepe to Göbekli Tepe would be a day's walk for someone moving across this terrain. Longer if you're traveling with children or elderly people, longer still if you're carrying supplies. Reaching the more distant sites in the network would require multi-day journeys. This is certainly possible. Humans have always been capable of long-distance movement, but it requires organization. Who decided when pilgrimages would happen? How were they coordinated across different communities? What provisions were made for travelers? Another challenge is that pilgrimage models usually assume the existence of home bases, permanent or semi-permanent settlements, from which people would depart and to which they would return. But we haven't found clear evidence of such settlements for the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. There are a few possible candidates. Navalichori had some domestic structures alongside its ritual architecture, and there are hints of residential areas at some sites, but nothing like the well-developed villages we see in later periods. It's possible that the settlements were built of perishable materials that haven't survived, or that they're buried deeper and haven't been found yet, or that people really were highly mobile and didn't maintain permanent bases at all. If they were truly mobile, then the ceremonial sites take on even greater significance. They would be the fixed points in an otherwise fluid landscape, the permanent markers that oriented movement and organized time. Imagine it. You spend most of the year moving across the territory with your extended family group, following game, collecting wild plants, living in temporary camps. But several times a year, according to patterns established by tradition, you make your way to one of the Stone Hill sites. There, you meet up with other groups, renew social bonds, conduct ceremonies, possibly exchange goods or arrange marriages. The site serves as a hub, a place of gathering that makes possible the social coordination necessary for long-term cultural survival. This would mean that the monumental architecture at sites like Karahan Tepe wasn't just religious expression, it was social infrastructure. The carved chambers were technologies for maintaining social cohesion across a dispersed population. The elaborate carvings and the sense of permanence and importance they conveyed helped justify the effort of traveling to these sites, helped mark them as special, as worthy of the journey. The ceremonies conducted in the chambers served to reaffirm shared beliefs and identities, to remind people that despite their geographical dispersal, they were part of a common cultural community. You trace your finger across the map, connecting Karahan Tepe to Gobekli Tepe, to Hamzan Tepe to Navalichori, creating chains of sites that might represent routes, networks of movement and communication. You notice that some sites seem to cluster together. Karahan Tepe and Hamzan Tepe are close enough that someone could realistically visit both in a day, while others are more isolated. You wonder if the clusters represent different communities, each maintaining their own local ceremonial centers, or if the proximity is coincidental, driven more by the availability of good limestone for carving than by social organization. The limestone is important. Not all stone is equally suitable for the kind of detailed carving found at these sites. The rock needs to be soft enough to work with stone tools, but hard enough to hold detail without crumbling. It needs to be available in large blocks that can be shaped into pillars several meters tall. And ideally, it should be close to the construction site, because transporting massive stones across distance is extremely difficult without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, neither of which existed in pre-pottery Neolithic Anatolia. The geology of southeastern Anatolia made these sites possible. The limestone bedrock of the region could be quarried and carved using the technology available to Neolithic people. Primarily other stones, harder rocks like flint or basalt used as hammers and chisels, along with patient, labor-intensive pecking and grinding. The relatively flat-topped hills, products of millions of years of geological uplift and erosion, provided natural platforms for construction, and the semi-arid climate meant that wooden elements, while used, certainly weren't strictly necessary for construction. You could create durable structures using primarily stone, which is why so much has survived, when equivalent wooden structures from wetter regions have completely disappeared. But geology only provides potential. Humans make choices about how to use that potential. Someone, or multiple someones, had to look at the landscape of southeastern Anatolia and see not just hills and rocks, but possibilities, opportunities, locations where sacred architecture could be built. Someone had to develop the techniques for carving limestone, had to learn through trial and error what tools worked best, what methods would produce the desired results. Someone had to conceive of the T-shaped pillar as a form, had to decide that this particular shape would be carved again and again, becoming a standardized element recognizable across the network of sites. These developments didn't happen overnight. The archaeological evidence suggests that the tradition of monumental stone architecture in this region developed over time, with earlier, simpler forms gradually giving way to more elaborate ones. But the chronology is still unclear. Were the sites built sequentially, with lessons learned at one site applied to later construction at others? Or were multiple sites under construction simultaneously, with different teams working in parallel, perhaps competing to create the most impressive structures? Without more precise dating, without written records, these questions are difficult to answer definitively. What we can say is that by around 9,500 BCE, maybe earlier, this tradition of monumental stone architecture was fully developed and widely distributed across southeastern Anatolia. The sites we've found represent what has survived and been discovered, but there were almost certainly others that haven't been found yet, and many more that have been destroyed by 12,000 years of human activity, weathering, and geological change. We're seeing hints of a pattern, not the full picture, and the pattern, even in its incomplete form, is remarkable. This region, for a period of perhaps 2,000 years, was home to a flourishing culture that built monumental architecture and maintained social networks across substantial distances, all without agriculture, without cities, without writing, without any of the features we typically associate with complex civilization. This was something different. A path of development that doesn't fit into the neat evolutionary sequences found in archaeology textbooks. You look up from the map to the window, where the actual landscape of Karahan Tepe is visible in the late afternoon light. Somewhere out there, perhaps visible from this very window, are other sites waiting to be discovered. Farmers plowing their fields might notice unusual stones. Shepherds like Shahin, the man who originally reported Karahan Tepe, might stumble across carvings weathering out of hillsides. Construction projects, road building, dam construction, all the activities of modern development might accidentally reveal ancient structures buried beneath accumulated soil. Each new discovery has the potential to change the picture, to add pieces to the puzzle that might clarify patterns or complicate them further. That's the nature of archaeological knowledge. It's always provisional, always subject to revision based on new evidence. What seems clear and settled can be overturned by a single excavation that reveals something unexpected. This keeps archaeologists humble, or should, reminding them that what they think they know is based on incomplete evidence and could change at any moment. But it also makes archaeology exciting. Every excavation season brings the possibility of discovery, of finding something that will shift understanding, that will open up new questions, even as it answers old ones. This is why people dedicate their careers to carefully digging through dirt, to documenting every pottery, sherd, and animal bone, to spending their summers sweating in trenches under the brutal Anatolian sun. The chance to touch the past, to be the first person in thousands of years to see something, to contribute to human understanding of where we come from, that's compelling enough to outweigh the hardships and frustrations, and the reality that most archaeological work is tedious and repetitive, and yields incremental rather than dramatic results. Dr. Karul walks into the office, dust covered from a day spent supervising excavation in Chamber 9. He glances at your map, at the network of sites you've been contemplating, and he smiles slightly. You're wondering how they're connected, he says. It's not a question. You nod. 12,000 years ago, no writing, supposedly no permanent settlements. But somehow they maintained this cultural pattern across hundreds of square kilometers. How? He pulls up a chair, pours himself tea from the pot that's always brewing in the corner of the office. That's the question that keeps me up at night, he admits. Every time I think I understand it, we find something that doesn't quite fit. Like today, we uncovered another panel in Chamber 9. More carvings. But the style is slightly different from what we've seen before. The technique is the same, but the composition, the way the animals are arranged, it's new. So was this done by the same people who carved the rest of the chamber? Or was it added later by a different group? Or are we seeing individual artistic variation within a shared tradition? And you can't tell from the stone itself? Not with current technology. The carvings don't have stratigraphy the way layers of soil do. We can say they were carved before the chamber was buried, obviously. But whether they were all carved at the same time, or whether the chamber was used and modified over decades or centuries, that's much harder to determine. This is one of the fundamental challenges in interpreting Karahan Tepe and related sites. Unlike tells the large mounded sites created by successive layers of human occupation, these stone structures don't have clear temporal sequences built into them. A chamber could have been carved in a matter of months and used for a single season before being abandoned. Or it could have been created over years, with different elements added at different times and used for centuries, before finally being ritually closed and buried. Both scenarios would leave broadly similar archaeological signatures. Dr. Karul continues. But here's what I think. I think we're looking at a network, yes, but not a unified one. Not a single culture or polity, but something more like a dialect continuum, languages that shade into each other, where neighboring groups can understand each other, but groups from opposite ends of the continuum can't. Shared core beliefs and practices, but with regional variation, individual interpretation, evolution over time. The T-shaped pillar is like a phoneme, a basic unit that appears everywhere, but is combined and used in different ways in different places. It's an intriguing analogy. Linguistic anthropology has shown that language spreads and evolves in complex ways, with zones of mutual intelligibility grading into difference as distance increases. Cultural practices might work similarly, especially in societies without written texts to standardize and freeze traditions. The core ritual architecture, underground chambers, T-pillars, animal carvings, would be recognizable across the network, but the details would vary based on local tradition, individual innovation, and change over time. This model allows for both unity and diversity. It explains how sites across the region could share fundamental characteristics while still showing distinctive features. It allows for cultural contact and influence without requiring centralized control or coordination. Groups could maintain their own traditions while still participating in a broader cultural sphere, borrowing ideas from neighbors, adapting practices to local conditions, innovating while respecting tradition. But it still requires communication, you point out. Even in a dialect continuum, you need enough contact between neighboring groups to maintain mutual intelligibility. If groups were isolated for too long, their traditions would diverge until they were no longer recognizably part of the same cultural complex. Exactly. Which means there had to be regular movement, regular interaction, probably multiple forms of it. Seasonal gatherings at the ceremonial sites, obviously. But also smaller scale visiting between groups, exchange of goods even if it wasn't formal trade, possibly intermarriage between groups to maintain social bonds. All the mechanisms that human societies have always used to create and maintain larger social networks. You think about this, trying to imagine the lived reality behind the abstract model. Individuals and families moving across the landscape, following paths known through generation after generation of use, arriving at a stone hill site during the designated season, setting up temporary camps nearby, greeting relatives and friends from other groups, catching up on news and gossip, participating in ceremonies that affirmed shared identities and beliefs, maybe negotiating marriages, maybe exchanging valuable goods like obsidian tools or distinctive stone beads, maybe just sharing meals and stories, and the simple pleasure of human company. These weren't abstract social forces or impersonal cultural processes. These were people, individuals with names and personalities and preferences. People who loved and argued and laughed and worried. People people whose lives were shaped by the rhythms of the natural world and the demands of survival, but who still found time for art and ritual and the creation of meaning. When we talk about cultural networks and information exchange and social organization, we're really talking about countless individual choices and actions that aggregated into patterns that we can detect 12,000 years later in the archaeological record. And yet, we'll never know any of those individuals. We'll never know their names, never hear their voices, never learn their specific stories. We can excavate their architecture and analyze their artifacts and reconstruct general patterns of behavior. Lived experience of being a specific person in this time and place that's lost forever. This is the melancholy of archaeology. The awareness that for all we learn, most of what mattered to the people we study remains inaccessible. Dr. Karul finishes his tea and stands. You follow him out of the office, across the excavation site to Chamber 9, the one he's been working in today. You descend the modern stairs into the cool darkness, and he directs your attention to the newly uncovered panel. It shows a procession of animals, aurochs, gazelles. What might be a leopard or other large cat, moving from left to right across the carved surface. But unlike the more static compositions you've seen in other chambers, these animals are clearly in motion, their legs positioned to suggest walking or running, their bodies leaning forward into movement. This is narrative, Dr. Karul says. Not just symbolic representation, but a story, a sequence. The animals are going somewhere, doing something. And here, he points to the far right side of the panel. You can see where the carving is unfinished. The outline of another animal, maybe a bird, barely sketched in, but not fully executed. You lean closer, tracing the faint lines with your eyes. Why would they leave it unfinished? That's the question. Maybe the carver died or left before completing the work. Maybe there was a deliberate decision to stop. Maybe the chamber was closed before the panel could be finished. But whatever the reason, it gives us a glimpse into process, into the fact that these carvings weren't magical manifestations, but actual work done by actual people who had to plan and execute and sometimes didn't finish what they started. The unfinished carving humanizes the site in a way that polished, completed work doesn't. It reminds you that behind every artifact is a person. The perfection we often see in ancient art and architecture is selection bias. We excavate the completed, successful work, and miss or discount the failures and false starts and abandoned projects that would give us a more realistic picture of ancient life. There's something else, Dr. Karul continues. Moving to the opposite wall of the chamber. We found this today, under a layer of fill. He illuminates a section of wall with his flashlight, and you see marks that are clearly different from the surrounding carvings. These are scratches, quick marks made with a sharp tool, not carefully pecked reliefs. They're crude, almost graffiti-like. And there are several different styles, suggesting multiple hands. Later additions, you ask? Much later. These are probably from the final phase of use, right before the chamber was filled. Maybe signatures, maybe prayers, maybe just someone's equivalent of Kilroy was here. We're hoping chemical analysis of the stone might let us distinguish between the original carving surface and these later marks, might give us separate dates for the main construction and these secondary additions. If that's possible, if these scratches can be dated independently from the main architectural features, it would provide crucial information about the site's history. It would tell us how long the chambers were in use, would give us a window into how practices changed over time, would show us that even sacred spaces can be adapted and modified and personalized by individuals who leave their own marks alongside the official, sanctioned art. The evening light is fading as you emerge from Chamber 9. Karul walks slowly back toward the office, picking your way carefully across uneven ground in the dimming light. Do you think we'll ever really understand it, you ask? Not just document it, but actually understand what it meant to them? He considers this for a long moment. I think we can get close. Not all the way. Never all the way. but close enough to appreciate the sophistication, the intention, the cultural richness. Close enough to recognize that these weren't primitive savages, but people as fully human as we are, capable of complex thought and emotion and artistic expression. If we can do that, if we can look at Karahan Tepe and see not just interesting ruins, but evidence of minds and hearts as complex as our own, then maybe we've understood enough. You nod, thinking about the network of sites spread across the map, about the thousands of people who must have participated in creating and maintaining this cultural tradition, about the uncounted hours of labor represented in the carved stones and excavated chambers. All of that effort, all of that care, but not entirely lost. The stones remain. The chambers remain. And as long as people care enough to excavate and study and wonder, some trace of that ancient meaning persists, passed down not through direct cultural continuity, but through the simple human impulse to connect with those who came before, to learn from the past, to find in ancient stones some reflection of our own eternal questions about life and meaning, and what it is to be human in a vast and often incomprehensible cosmos. The stars are appearing now, brilliant in the clear desert air. You think about those ancient people looking up at these same stars, creating their own stories to explain the lights in the sky, their own meanings to make sense of their lives. The specific stories are gone, lost to time, but the impulse that created them, the need to find pattern and meaning, to connect earth to sky, to place human existence in a larger context that persists. We still look up at stars and wonder. We still create stories and build monuments and try to leave marks that will outlast us. Perhaps we find the deepest connection to Karahan Tepe and to those who built it. The night settles over the site, darkness reclaiming the ancient stones as it has every night for 12 millennia. Tomorrow the work will resume. The excavation will continue. New discoveries will be made. New questions will arise. New pieces will be added to the forever incomplete puzzle of human history. But tonight, there's rest and stars and the quiet satisfaction of spending your days in service of understanding, in the endless human project of trying to know where we come from and what it all means. You kneel in the sifting area, shaking a screen filled with soil from Chamber 6, watching as dirt filters through the mesh, leaving behind anything too large to pass: stones, pottery fragments, bones. It's tedious work, repetitive and physically tiring, but essential. This is how archaeologists find the small artifacts that tell stories about daily life, about what people ate and what tools they used and how they lived. In an hour of sifting, you might find a dozen animal bones, a few worked stone tools, maybe some charcoal from ancient fires. Each of these items gets bagged, tagged, and cataloged, added to the growing database of material culture from Karahan Tepe. Today, you're hoping to find plant remains, seeds, grain fragments, anything that might provide evidence of what people were eating 12,000 years ago. This is crucial information because one of the biggest questions about sites like Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe is how they relate to the development of agriculture. The standard narrative has been that agriculture came first, creating food surplus that enabled people to settle down and build permanent structures. But these sites predate or are contemporary with the earliest evidence of farming. Maybe monumental architecture came first, and the need to support the labor force building these structures drove the development of agricultural practices. Klaus Schmidt, the lead archaeologist at Gobekli Tepe, proposed this controversial idea. He suggested that Gobekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, who gathered seasonally to construct and use the site, and that the need to feed these gatherings, hundreds of people congregating several times a year, created pressure to develop more intensive food production methods. Rather than first came farming, then came civilization. The sequence might have been first came religion, then came farming. It's an elegant theory, and it would explain why these elaborate sites appear so early in the archaeological record. But it's also speculative. And like all theories in archaeology, it needs to be tested against evidence. That's why you're sifting dirt, looking for seeds. The presence or absence of domesticated plant species in the soil layers at Karahan Tepe could provide crucial support for, or evidence against various theories about the relationship between monument building and agriculture. The problem is that plant remains rarely survive 12,000 years unless conditions are exactly right. Seeds and grains need to be carbonized, essentially turned to charcoal by burning to survive in the archaeological record, or they need to be preserved in anaerobic conditions, sealed away from oxygen that would allow decomposition. At Karahan Tepe, the soil is relatively dry, which helps with preservation. But finding intact seeds is still rare, and mostly a matter of luck. So far this season, the team has recovered a few dozen seeds from various chambers. Most are from wild plants, wild grasses, wild pulses, the ancestors of modern wheat and barley, but not yet showing signs of domestication. The key differences between wild and domestic cereals are subtle but detectable. Domestic wheat and barley have tougher rachises, the part of the plant that connects the seed head to the stem. In wild cereals, the rachis shatters easily when the seeds are ripe, scattering seeds to the ground for natural propagation. This is good for the plant but bad for humans trying to harvest it, since by the time the seeds are ripe enough to eat, many have already fallen. Early farmers would have preferentially collected seeds from plants with non-shattering rachises, since those were easier to harvest. Over many generations of this selection, the tougher rachis became dominant, creating truly domesticated cereals that depend on humans for propagation, since their seeds don't scatter naturally. The seeds found at Karahan Tepe don't show these domestication traits yet. They're wild type, with brittle rachises that would have shattered on their own. This suggests that the people using Karahan Tepe were still harvesting wild cereals, probably gathering them from naturally occurring stands, rather than cultivating them in managed fields. But, and this is important, the absence of domesticated cereals doesn't mean people weren't manipulating their environment in other ways. There's a whole range of practices between pure hunter-gathering and full agriculture. Protecting favored wild plants, clearing competing vegetation, sowing wild seeds in favorable locations, creating conditions that increase the abundance of useful species, without necessarily changing the genetics of those species. These practices are sometimes called proto-agriculture, or low-level food production, and they're invisible or nearly invisible in the archaeological record. We can't distinguish a stand of wild wheat that grew naturally from a stand that grew because someone scattered seeds there last season. We can't tell if a cleared area was deliberately maintained to encourage certain plants or if it's just a natural clearing. This is frustrating for archaeologists trying to understand the trajectory of agricultural development, but it's also a reminder of how much human activity leaves no trace. You find a seed, a small, dark grain caught in the mesh of your sifting screen. You carefully pick it up with tweezers and place it in a small vial. Later, a specialist will examine it under a microscope, will measure it precisely, will compare its morphology to databases of known plant species, will try to determine what species it is and whether it shows any signs of domestication. This single seed, smaller than a grain of rice, might contain information that shifts our understanding of agricultural origins, or it might be just another data point confirming what we already knew. You won't know until the analysis is complete, and even then, one seed isn't conclusive. It's only by accumulating hundreds or thousands of these tiny data points that patterns become clear. But agriculture is only part of the subsistence question. People at Karahan Tepe were eating more than just plants. They were hunting animals, and the bones from those animals make up the bulk of what you're finding in your sifting screen. Today alone you've found fragments of gazelle, aurochs, wild sheep, and what the zoo archaeologist thinks is wild boar. These are all wild species, animals that had to be hunted rather than herded. Like the wild cereals, the wild game suggests a hunter-gatherer economy. People getting their food from the natural environment rather than from managed fields and flocks. But again, it's not quite that simple. The line between hunting wild animals and herding domestic ones isn't sharp. There are intermediate stages. Following herds and protecting them from predators. Culling selectively to favor certain traits. Confining animals in enclosures for part of the year while letting them range freely at other times. The earliest domestic sheep and goats are hard to distinguish from their wild ancestors based on bones alone. The changes are subtle, slight modifications in bone structure, small shifts in average size, alterations in the age and sex ratios of animals being killed. It takes sophisticated statistical analysis of large samples to detect these patterns. The zooarchaeologist working at Karahan Tepe has been collecting this data for 3 seasons now, measuring every animal bone that comes out of the excavation, building a database that can be analyzed for patterns. Preliminary results suggest that the animals being killed at Karahan Tepe were indeed wild, but interestingly, the age profile is unusual. In a purely wild hunting scenario, you'd expect to see a mix of ages, with hunters taking whatever animals they could catch. But at Karahan Tepe, there's a preponderance of young adult animals in their prime. This could indicate selective hunting, targeting specific age classes because they yielded the best meat, or because older, tougher animals were harder to kill and less worth the effort. Or it could indicate something else. If people were following wild herds, protecting them, perhaps even controlling their movements to some degree, they could be more selective about which animals they killed. They might leave the breeding adults alone to ensure future population, taking instead younger animals that had reached adult size but hadn't yet bred. This kind of game management is documented in various hunter-gatherer societies and represents a middle ground between pure hunting and full pastoralism. You finish sifting your bucket of soil and carry the screen to the washing station, rinsing off the remaining dirt to better see what you've collected. Among the bone fragments and stones, you spot something unusual. A worked bone tool, probably an awl based on its pointed shape. It's been polished smooth by use, the tip worn down from being pushed through hide or plant fibers. This is someone's tool, something they made and used, something that was part of their daily life. You imagine the person who made this awl, sitting somewhere near Karahan Tepe, methodically grinding a bone fragment against a stone to create a useful point. The kind of patient, repetitive work that filled so much of Neolithic life. Tools like this tell us about the practical aspects of existence, the mundane reality behind the spectacular carved chambers. People needed tools to process animal hides into leather, to work plant fibers into cordage, to sew garments together. They needed scrapers for cleaning hides, blades for cutting meat, hammerstones for working other stones into useful shapes. The assemblage of tools found at a site provides a window into daily activities, into the work that had to be done to survive and maintain a way of life. At Karahan Tepe, the tool assemblage is dominated by stone implements made from flint, obsidian, and limestone. Flint provided sharp cutting edges for knives and scrapers. Obsidian, imported from sources in central Anatolia, made the sharpest blades and was probably valued for both functional and symbolic reasons. Limestone was used for grinding and pounding, for processing plant materials, and possibly minerals for pigments. The variety and sophistication of the tools indicate a developed technology, people who knew their materials and how to work them efficiently. But there's a puzzle. Despite all the elaborate stone carving at Karahan Tepe, we find relatively few of the actual tools that would have been used for that carving. Where are the hammerstones used to pound and peck the limestone pillars? Where are the pointed tools used to incise the detailed animal figures? Some have been found, certainly, but not in the quantities you'd expect, given the massive amount of carving work evident at the site. It's possible that the tools were taken away when work was finished, perhaps because they were valuable and reusable. Or maybe the actual carving was done by specialists who kept their tools with them as they moved from site to site across the network. This idea of specialist carvers is intriguing. If the similar artistic style at different sites indicates the work of the same artisans or artistic schools, then we're seeing evidence of specialization, of people whose role in society was at least partly defined by their carving skills. This doesn't necessarily mean full-time specialists. They could have been people who spent most of their time on ordinary subsistence activities, but who were called upon to do carving work during construction or renovation of ceremonial sites. But even part-time specialization represents a form of social complexity, a division of labor that goes beyond the simple age and gender divisions found in all human societies. The question of specialization ties into larger questions about social organization. Who decided what would be carved, and where? Who determined the overall design of the chambers and the placement of pillars? Who had the authority to mobilize the labor needed for construction? These are questions about power, about how decisions were made and enforced in a society that left no written records of its governance structures. One possibility is that decision-making was collective, done through consensus among the community or communities using the site. Another is that there were leaders, individuals with authority based on age, or ritual knowledge, or force of personality, or hereditary claims. These leaders wouldn't necessarily have been rulers, in the sense we usually mean. They might not have had the power to coerce or punish, might not have controlled resources or had a monopoly on violence, but they might have had influence, the ability to persuade and guide, to shape collective decisions without absolutely determining them. There's some indirect evidence for emerging social hierarchy in the Neolithic Near East. Burial practices from slightly later periods show differential treatment, with some individuals receiving more elaborate burials that include valuable grave goods, suggesting they held higher status in life. And the very existence of monumental architecture like Karahan Tepe implies some level of coordinated labor, which in turn suggests organizational structures beyond simple consensus. But we must be careful not to project our own assumptions about power and hierarchy onto the past. It's possible that Neolithic societies organized labor and made collective decisions in ways that don't match any contemporary model, in ways that we literally don't have the conceptual vocabulary to describe because they're outside our experience. Maybe authority was tied to ritual knowledge in ways that had nothing to do with political or economic power. Maybe decision-making alternated among different people or groups, rather than being centralized. Maybe the whole framework of thinking about power and hierarchy is inappropriate for societies that might have conceived of social relations in fundamentally different terms. These are the kinds of questions that can drive an archaeologist to distraction. You have evidence, stones, bones, seeds, tools, but that evidence radically underdetermines the possible interpretations. Multiple different social structures could have produced the same archaeological signature. Without written records, without direct testimony, you're always guessing, always speculating, even when your speculations are informed by comparative evidence and theoretical frameworks drawn from anthropology and sociology. You carry your tray of finds to the sorting table, where they'll be cataloged and stored for future analysis. Another specialist is already there, examining pottery fragments under a magnifying lamp, trying to match sherds from different buckets that might have come from the same original vessel. It's painstaking work, and most of the time, it leads nowhere. The sherds don't match. The vessel can't be reconstructed. You're left with just fragments that tell you only that pottery existed, but nothing about its form or function or decoration. But occasionally, you get lucky. Occasionally, fragments do fit together, and suddenly you have half a bowl or a substantial portion of a jar, and you can see how it was made, how it was used, maybe even what it contained if enough organic residue remains. These reconstructions provide concrete information, transforming abstract people-made pottery into specific knowledge about ceramic technology, vessel forms, usage patterns. They remind you why the tedious work is worth doing, why you spend hours sifting dirt and sorting sherds. Because sometimes, you find something that genuinely advances understanding. The pottery specialist looks up as you approach. Find anything interesting? You show her the bone awl. She examines it briefly, nods. Nice find. Bag it for the bone tool collection. Then she returns to her sherds, and you move on to log your finds in the database, adding your small contributions to the accumulating mass of data that someday, when enough has been collected, might reveal patterns that aren't yet visible, might answer questions that haven't yet been fully formulated. This is how archaeological knowledge is built, not through dramatic discoveries of intact tombs filled with treasure, but through the patient accumulation of mundane finds, each individually insignificant, but collectively meaningful. You catalog your bones and stones and seeds. You note their exact location in the grid system that maps the site. You record their depth and the soil layer they came from. You photograph them and measure them and add them to the growing archive. And you trust that someone, maybe you, maybe someone else, maybe not for years, or decades. We'll look at all this data and see something. We'll notice a pattern or correlation that changes how we think about Karahan Tepe and the people who built it. The sun is setting as you finish your cataloging. The excavation site is emptying again. Another day's work done. You look out over the exposed chambers, at the carved pillars standing in the growing shadows, at the trenches and screens and tools that mark human presence in this landscape. In the morning, it will all resume the digging, the sifting, the cataloging, the analysis, the patient, methodical work of archaeology, trying to recover meaning from matter, trying to hear voices that have been silent for 12,000 years. You think about the agricultural question that started your day, about whether the people of Karahan Tepe were hunter-gatherers or proto-farmers or something in between. The evidence is mixed, ambiguous, open to interpretation, but maybe that ambiguity is itself revealing. Maybe the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture wasn't a sharp break, but a long, gradual process, with different groups at different stages, experimenting with different strategies, some succeeding and spreading, while others failed and were forgotten. Maybe Karahan Tepe represents a particular moment in that transition. A society at a threshold, maintaining traditional hunting and gathering practices while beginning to experiment with plant cultivation and animal management, not yet fully agricultural, but no longer purely hunter-gatherers either. If that's the case, then Karahan Tepe offers a window into one of the most important transitions in human history. The shift from foraging to farming that made possible everything that came after cities, states, writing, civilization in all its forms. But it's a window that shows us the transition was more complex, more gradual, and more variable than simple models suggest. And it reminds us that the people making this transition had no idea they were making history. We're just trying to survive and thrive, making daily decisions about what to eat and how to get it, decisions that in aggregate and over generations added up to revolutionary changes in human society. The stars are appearing as you make your way back to camp. Tomorrow, you'll return to the sifting screens, looking for more seeds, more bones, more fragments of evidence. The work will continue, as it has for multiple field seasons now, as it will for seasons to come. And slowly, incrementally, the picture will become clearer, even as new questions arise to replace the ones that get answered. This is the archaeologist's lot, to pursue understanding that always remains slightly out of reach, to chase a past that can never be fully recovered, but to find satisfaction in the pursuit itself, in the careful documentation and thoughtful analysis, in the contribution to human knowledge, however modest it might be. The stones of Karahan Tepe have waited 12,000 years to tell their story. They can wait a bit longer while we learn to understand their language.